Shalom Aleichem, good morning. It's Lag Ba'Emer. Yom Shlishi Lag Ba'Emer, Hey Tafshin Pei Gimel. And I'm giving you the share that I should have been giving you on Friday. Lihavin Inyan Hilula DiRaShbI from Tafshin Lamed Hey. It was a weekday Fabrengen, so there's obviously Mamer from a tape, and it's long. It's 11 Amudim long, and I'm dividing it into 4. I don't have to, but I choose to. In other words, there'll be 4 shorter shiurim on this Mamer. First, let me just set the stage. The first shiur is going to introduce Rabbi Yossi, and that the idea of Rabbi Yossi is Toraso Umnaso. His life is Torah, his vocation, his business is Torah, and the Rebbe is going to make an argument which says that even someone who's Toraso Umnaso also needs tefillah and melacha. In other words, there's 3 levels in an omal and avodah. There's Birurim, there's tefillah, and there's Torah. And each person has an ikir. For some people, the most important thing is Torah. For other people, the most important thing is tefillah. And for other people, still the most important thing is melacha. But even if your Inyan is Torah, you also have to have tefillah and melacha. And the Rebbe is going to argue that that's the Mamer the Matziv of RaShbI. And I'll get to it when I start the shiur. The second shiur is going to be an expose on the Madrega of RaShbI Yachoi and the whole idea of Toraso Umnaso, which is, of course, classic. RaShbI Yachoi is the Madrega of Toraso Umnaso, and the Rebbe is going to argue that there's different Madregas in Limud Torah. And when you learn Torah in the Madrega of Rabbi Shimon, so the Torah has an effect on the world by itself. And although I'm still busy with the Mamer, meaning I don't know it perfectly, obviously I never will, it seems to me that the second shiur is in a way a steer to the first shiur, because in the second shiur the implication is that some tzaddikim don't have to have the amal melacha and the amal tefillah. It happens from their Torah alone. But that's going to be the second shiur, presenting us with the idea of Rabbi Yossi being in the Madrega of Toraso Umnaso. The third shiur is interesting. This is an idea which the Rebbe spoke in many sichas, but here it's in a Mamer, and the way I'm going to structure the classes, you'll see, I'm going to move the Mamer around a little bit to make it topical, is going to be about that every Yid can have Toraso Umnaso. Even though Toraso Umnaso is Madrega of RaShbI, we can have a partial concept of Toraso Umnaso. The Rebbe is going to give several possibilities. How Anashim Kerkenu could have B'daka min Adaka, or Begasa min Agasa, depending on how you want to look at it, Inyan of Toraso Umnaso. And the last shiur is going to be the close of the Mamer, which is going to celebrate Lag Ba'Emer and Rabbi Yossi. And if there's, a point that you want to talk to, it'll be the Inyan of Abbas Yisrael. So I made the decision to teach this Mamer in 4 parts. It'll be 4 smaller shiurim rather than 2 or 3 gargantuan shiurim, which is what I would normally do. I just feel like it's the right way to teach this Mamer. And we're going to start with the first part. The first part introduces us not so much to Rabbi Yossi. The second shiur is going to introduce us to Rabbi Yossi. The first part introduces us to the idea that when the Eibishter created the world, he said, Amal ya Amal Yulad. Amal Adam la Amal Yivalad, the Rebbe used to say. Adam la Amal Yulad. Man was created for toil. And the Gemara says, you have this a lot in the Maimarim of Balak. Mimana Lahibet Ovam b'yankiv leira omal b'Yisrael. They bring that in the Gemara you have 3 amalim, 3 toils: amal Torah, amal Sicha, amal Melacha. The toil of Torah, the toil of Tefillah, and the toil of Melacha, which means Birurim, being involved in the world. And of course, amal Torah on the highest level is Toraso Umnaso, and the Toraso Umnaso on the highest level is a Malach Denas Sadi Achirim. You don't do anything; you just learn Torah, and everything is resolved by itself. In this first shiur, the Rebbe is going to argue that whatever amal of the 3 you are, you need all 3. And the implication is going to appear, at least superficially, that this is true even by Rabbi Shimon. But when you learn the second shiur, it's going to appear to become a bit of a kasha. But let's begin the Mamer, let's not waste any time. Lihavin Inyan Hilula DiRaShbI. Let's explain the idea of the holiday, the celebration, which is associated with RaShbI Yachoi, that of course RaShbI Yachoi himself made this Yom Tov. You read this in Idra Zuta, in Pachas Azinu and Zayhar, how he said to celebrate and to be besimcha on the day that his neshama would be eila b'sa'ara hashamayma, and it's been determined by the Gedali Abu Kubalim, by the Arizal or whatever, that is Yom Chai Iyar Lag Ba'omer, and it's considered a great simcha, an unbelievable simcha. The Rebbe spoke about people, the Avram Halevi, a Talmud of the Ari, who said Nachem every day, including Shabbos and Yom Tov. But when he said Nachem on Hilula DiRaShbI, there was a very, very terrible effect, not favorable effect, because this is Yom Simchas Chev RaShbI Hine. It's explained in Tanya in the 2 letters which speak about this talkus. And the following classic idea, which we've heard so many times. Number 1, on the day that a tzaddik, a nasi b'Yisrael, passes away, and we don't use the word ptira like we do by a regular person. We use the word istalkus. And the difference between the word ptira and the difference between the word istalkus is very obvious, because istalkus means an aliyah. Istalkus means, as the Rebbe calls it, gilui bebechinas reimamus, a revelation, a high revelation, but it's a revelation from a place of indirectness, that it's b'chol mokim b'shava, like you have in the Basi Lagani. Kadiskafe siteracha istalik yikara the kuchabricha kulu omen. And you cannot say that istalik in that case means to depart. The Rebbe said that diva zoken as istalkus meint avegens einen wilde Menschen proi adam, because histalkus doesn't mean to go away. It means to be revealed in a uniform way, in a universal way, in a makif way. So on the one hand, he's more here, on the other hand, he's less here. He's less here because he's not here in a personalized way, in a pnimius way, but he's more here because since the gili is makif, it's a greater gili. And it's b'chol mokem b'shav, it's everywhere equally, which is why the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya that in a certain aspect, after the stalkus of a tzaddik, it's easier to have a connection to that tzaddik than when the tzaddik was melubish in a goof and limited kvayachol to the ideas of zman and mokem. So that's how we translate the word histalkus. And in the histalkus of a tzaddik, there's 3 things that take place. Number 1, everything that he did during his lifetime has an aliyah. The neshama has an aliyah. And of course, the way to explain the aliyah of the neshama. No way, I want to make it clear. The avodah of the tzaddik has an aliyah, not the neshama. Point 1 is not the neshama, the tzaddik. Everything that the tzaddik did has an aliyah. The way to explain this is you use the illustration of Shabbos. Right? How do we explain Shabbos? You work a whole week. Shabbos, you stop working. When you stop working, there's menucha, there's rest. And there's oinek, there's pleasure, there's delight. When one stops to work, he's able to look at his work in a place, in a way of being removed from the investment in the work, and he's able to see the pleasure of his work, he's able to see the accomplishments of his work, and he's also able to see what about his work still needs correction. So this is called an aliyah. You work a whole week, but when you're busy working, you're using your hands or your feet or even your mind, but you're so involved in the tedium, you're so involved in the little details, that you have no ability to see how the thing I'm doing at this minute ties directly into my greater scheme. But when it goes up, when you stop to work and the work itself rises up, then you're able to see it from a different perspective. So just like Shabbos, there's aliyah, so Eilamis, all the work we did during the previous week has an aliyah. So the yahrzeit of any person, but especially the yahrzeit of a tzaddik, is like a Shabbos for a lifetime. That kol avedos asher kol meshech mechayev, a whole lifetime of work has an aliyah. It goes up from the level of asiyah to be included in higher madregas. So it's the work that has an aliyah. And of course, every time there's another yahrzeit, there's another aliyah. And the way the aliyah works is that a person lives in this world and he does many good deeds. Included in the many good deeds is he plants many seeds. The seeds are planted in other people. The seeds are planted in many places. The seeds are planted in many things where he leaves his mark. And even after the person, especially at tzaddik, at Rebbe, Nasi, and Shama Klolis, like RaShbI, leaves this world, these seeds continue to grow, what the Alter Rebbe calls geduli gedulin, children and grandchildren. In other words, every good action we do has many, many ripples, has many, many consequential effects that follow the initial effects that we did. So after a person passes away, the influence on the physical world continues. And over time, it actually grows, because I was mashpi on one person, and that person was mashpi on 10 more. So my influence is now to 11 people, and after a certain amount of time, each one of those 10 is mashpi on 10 more, and it becomes 100 people. And every year in the Yartzeit, the new Pu'ules that happened in this world, from the life of the tzaddik who's already passed, have an aliyah. So the first thing the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya about the Yartzeit of a tzaddik, the Histalkus Hilula of a tzaddik, especially in RaShbI, is Ma'asav Teirasei V'Avedasei, or Elim L'mayla. On a Yartzeit they have an aliyah, his actions have an aliyah. Number 2, V'oz Higam Aliyas Nishmasei L'Sharsha U'Makaira. That's a date when the Neshama itself also has an aliyah, and the aliyah of the Neshama is the Sharsha U'Makaira Hachi Elyon, the highest levels. And these are two separate things. One is the aliyah of Ma'asav Teirasei V'Avedasei, the good deeds we did in this world, that we leave in this world. And the other is the aliyah of the neshama. The aliyah of the neshama is purer. The aliyah of the neshama is more spiritual. But the aliyah of the neshama is not elevating the lowest thing. It's elevating something which began on a very high madrege and is going to a higher madrege. So these two aspects of aliyah. The first is the aliyah of his life and his avodah, and the second is the aliyah of his neshama. But then comes the third idea, the Inyan Zeh, and these two ideas, aliyah b'avedasei and sherish nishmasei, the aliyah of his work and his neshama, nimsha b'gila lamata. The third idea is that when the life of a person has an aliyah, when the neshama of a person has an aliyah, there's more light brought into this world. Because since those aliyahs, the aliyah of Ma'asav Teirasei V'Avedasei and the aliyah of neshama was based on the avodah that he did here, so when those aliyahs take place down here where the work was done, there is a revelation of those aliyahs. Move on, which leads us to the following. Now that we established that Bechlal the aliyah, the stalkus of a tzaddik, especially RaShbI, is connected to three ideas. Number 1, aliyah of his work. Number 2, aliyah of his neshama. And number 3, as a result of those two aliyahs. This is a gila lemate ba'aretz. It teaches us as follows. Inyan Hilula DiRaShbI, if you want to understand the meaning of the Yartzeit of RaShbI, which is called Hilula his chasaneh, you have to understand that it's kosher in malaseh shel RaShbI. It has to do with the level of RaShbI. And of course the level of RaShbI means before the work. We just described the aliyah of his avodah and the aliyah of his neshama. Ma'alaseh means his neshama by itself, which is then going to spill over into his avodah. And as we explained, that the milas of RaShbI as he is by himself, and the milas of RaShbI which have to do with avodah, are revealed down here. So it says the Rabbi, you have to say that the gilui of these two ideas, of the avodah of RaShbI and of the neshama of RaShbI, which have an aliyah Inyan Hilula shalei, it happening in this world, that has to be connected to the work of RaShbI and the work that he did in this world. And in this itself, not just the Torah of RaShbI, this actual behavioral work that the RaShbI did. So if we're going to understand what happens at the Yartzeit of RaShbI, you have to understand the miles of RaShbI, which have to do with what he did in this world, including Ma'aseh Paltiel. And again, I want to repeat that there seems to be a contradiction in how the Mamer develops. In the beginning, the Rebbe is going to argue that RaShbI was involved not only in Torah, but also in avodah, and also in Tikkun Ha'olam, in Amal Melacha. But then when he gets into the madrega of RaShbI, you're going to get the impression that all of these three things happened as a result of the Torah alone, the Toraso Umnaso alone, as you'll see in the second shiur. But one thing is true about this Mamer, it's a long Mamer, but the Rebbe is going to answer this question, Lihavin Inyan Hilula DiRaShbI. How do you understand the meaning of Hilula DiRaShbI? It's going to be explained several times. The first is on the bottom of page 380 and the top of page 381. The second is on page 385. We have actually a paragraph that begins Lihavin Inyan Hilula DiRaShbI. And like I said, superficially it's going to appear like there's a contradiction between what he says in the beginning of the Mamer and what he says later in the Mamer. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we're going to learn it and we're going to talk about it. But let's continue to learn. To explain what happened on Rabbi Shimei's Histalkus, which further explains that DiRaShbI. We have to begin by talking about his life. In general, the life of a person. Nechlakim is divided Talmud u'maisa, to learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. But L'shein Razal, the Gemara says in Kedushin that there's a machlokes Rabbi Kiva and Abtaifim whether Talmud Gadol or Maisa Gadol. And in this Mamer Chazal, you don't divide it up into three: Torah, Tefillah, and mitzvahs is just 2, Talmud and Maisa. But now he breaks it up further. The pasuk says, Adam l'amol yulad, man was created for toil, or as the Rebbe always says, Adam l'amol yivalech, mizeh move on. And of course the Rebbe knows the pasuk, the Fanatei Shalom, in the beginning, where the Rebbe RaShbI misquoted a pasuk, and the Chazan corrected him. So the Rebbe RaShbI said, my father was a big medaktik, and he also knew the correct way to say things, and nevertheless there were certain psukim which he said dafka incorrectly, and I'm doing the same thing. Why he didn't explain move, and the fact that man was created for hard work indicates this. A person's work in serving Kadosh Baruch Hu has to be the extent of exertion, of exhaustedness, which simply means that it's kosher to minyan ha'maisa. Where do people work hard? With their body. You exert yourself, you exhaust yourself. Which includes also not just that I'm working indeed, but I'm working indeed where I'm pushing myself to the point of kfiyah, lashon kfiyah v'hechanach. Like you have in Gemara that the word maisa means to force. In the Alter Rebbe they get a Kaddish. V'oya maisa tzedakah shalom. V'avedas tzedakah hashkel v'etachad olam, where the Alter Rebbe explains the word maisa and he explains the word avoida, and how avoida is more excessive than maisa. But both words mean to work hard. Both words mean to work exceptionally hard. Maisa and avoida. So maasa means to force. Says the Rebbe Ella, even though if a person has to work hard, there has to be maisa to the point of kfiyah. There's actually 3 different levels of this toil. And the Rebbe quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Amal Melacha, Amal Shicha, Amal Teda. The toil of work, which means Pasha to go out into the world and work to earn a parnasa. The toil of tefillah, which means I sit in a shul and I daven till the Eibush sends me by parnasa. And the toil of Teda, where I sit and learn Teda, and because I'm learning Teda on a level of Toraso Umnaso, so the parnasa comes to me automatically. And he explains, Amal Melacha, the toil of work, Koyam Lachas Birurim. It's the work of going out into the world and making a living in the good old-fashioned way, where I have to make a change in the world to provide me with parnasa. But of course, the point why the Eibush set this up, that a person has to work for his parnasa this way, is because of birur. That's how you elevate the world, by being involved with it. Amal Shicha, the toil of words goes on Davening, then Shicha goes on tefillah, as the Gemara says, Shenem Avayetzi Yitzchak Lasuach Basada. That Yitzchak went out to talk in the field. So Davening is Omo. And there's an avodas tefillah where a person davens with such a tapchas hanefesh that from the tefillah comes panos, like it says in the Yeres HaKadosh in Kuntesach Hov Mashkas Apetz Chaim in the beginning, that the mile of tefillah over Torah and mitzvahs is that it's mishana teva ha'elam rafes hachelim levarach hashonim, to give panos and to heal the sick and so forth. So there's a madreg of tefillah which is so powerful that it changes the world physically, but the power of that tefillah to change the world is amal tefillah. And there's Mamer that speak about this. Nayan Beis in the second chelik. There's the Karav of the Shem Chol Keru Chalak Kiru be'emes, and in that Mamer Nayan Beis is ein emes el tefillah, in contrast to the ein emes el Torah. And he explains what madreg of tefillah this is. That from the davening alone comes the parnasa, and I think it connected to the story of tefillah's chana the way it's explained in the Mamer and in the Sichas. And then lastly, v'nei suvazeh yeshna mal Torah. There's the toil of Torah, that a person can learn Torah, and from the Torah alone comes his parnasa. And this, of course, is the madrega of Toraso Umnaso, where the Gemara says that Harbi also can Rabbi Shimon, V'lo also be Yadam, Harbi also can Rabbi Shmuel, also be Yad. Meaning, the madrega of Toraso Umnaso, even in the Zman HaShas, was very rare. Toraso Umnaso doesn't mean I learn all day. Toraso Umnaso means I learn all day, and parnasa happens automatically. Like the Lashon HaGemara, Malachta Inasai Diachedim, you sit and learn Torah, and your parnasa comes from somebody else. Like having the Gemara in Baba Metzia about Rabbi Shimon, and so on. So there's a person who makes a parnasa by going to work. There's a person who makes a parnasa by davening. And the person who makes a parnasa by simply learning Torah. But he's learning Torah in such a madrega where it changes the world. This idea that Torah could be a person's vocation is explained in many places in Chassidus. Including one particular Mamer of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and in footnote 11, the Mitzvah until Kol Adam Avad Tafish Peitas. So basically, you have a choice, right? And I guess this choice has a lot to do with Sheidish HaNeshama and Chunas HaNefesh, v'chuli v'chuli. How a person is going to make a parnasa, how a person is going to serve the Eibush in this world. But then he continues, V'hinei. Each of these three ways, Sheba Amal and hard work, Amal Melacha, Amal Sicha, Amal Torah. Each person needs all three. That even though one person's derech is Amal Melacha, and another person's derech is Amal Sicha, and another person's derech is Amal Torah, each one needs all three. The Yachad of Amal Torah, that a person whose life is like RaShbI Yechoi's life, Toraso Umnaso Amal Torah, so Amal Melacha, there needs to be the toil for Parnasa. Or Mamer, like it says in Pirkei Avos, it's called Torah she'ein ima melacha sefer b'Torah. Torah, that melacha doesn't have any kiyum. Now, of course, this Mishnah, called Torah ein ima melacha sefer b'Torah, should appear to be a contradiction to the concept of Toraso Umnaso. Because the very concept of Toraso Umnaso is, I do nothing except learn Torah, and my parnasa comes to me min hashmayim like mun. Like the Gemara brings the Psukim in Tanakh, where the Navi took out the Tinsenes Hamon and he showed them that if you learn Torah, you can get Parnasa Mon Min HaShamayim. And I think it is on some level a contradiction. That on the one hand we say you learn Torah and the Parnasa comes automatically, and here the Rebbe is saying no, even if Toraso Umnaso, there has to be Malach. Well, that is that Tzarech Liyas Amal Sich, you have to also daven, which is Inyan Hilula. Even when RaShbI, it's brought the idea that he has to daven. That even though his Torah was his vocation, still he davened every single year. Now in the Hanacha that I have, there's a Maramokah missing. There's no source for this Piskam that RaShbI davened once a year. But on the next page, in footnote 22, when this idea is mentioned the second time, he brings Rabbi Inyan and Brachas to the different Rabbi Inyan and the different Brachas. RaShbI davened once a year. Befrat, this is enhanced further. As explained in a Mamer from the Mezitcher Magid, which I actually spent some time looking up this morning again. There's a Mishnah in Shabbos which talks about what you're allowed to wear on Shabbos that's considered dress versus what you're not allowed to wear on Shabbos, which is considered carrying. So the Mishnah brings the sons can go out with knots, and the Bnei Melachim go out with zugim, which means with bells, v'chol adam. And the Mezitcher Magid explains this whole thing api Chasidus. And what it explains api Chasidus is that even a person who's Toraso Umnaso sometimes has to go out and make a living, which seems like a contradiction to the very definition of Toraso Umnaso. And if a person who's Toraso Umnaso has to go out and make a living, he has to daven to protect himself from the world. So if he's on a higher level, which is called bonim, it's enough kshadim, that means machshava. But if he's on a lower level, which is called bnei melachim, so now he has to have zugim, he has to make noise, daven out loud or learn Torah out loud, because in order to protect yourself from the world, machshava is not sufficient. So in this Mamer, the Mezitcher Magid, it says, the Misha Toraso Umnaso, a person whose Torah is his vocation, Tzarech Inyan Hilula needs to have a davening, not also, but especially. Turn to page 380. Since the nature of his life and his connection to the Eibush that is deeper, and the Shmira that he needs is Eidele, so in the Ge'esham, Inyan Hilula b'Yeser, his tefillah is even in a higher madreg. So, even though there's three darkei omal in life, there's three paths to struggle and to work and to parnasa, there is in each one all three. Amal Malach has to daven and learn, Amal Sicha has to work and learn, and Amal Torah, he just mentions he has to also work and he also has to daven. Later on this page, the Rebbe is going to explain where you see by RaShbI also the infant Ma'aser B'Peil Malach. Another proof that a person who's Toraso Umnaso has to have tefillah is memavur b'makom acher. As explained in other places about Moshe Rabbeinu, we have this sugya tefillah on in tefillah Asher. The tefillah only goes on Mashiach, but we're not going into that. But tefillah Asher goes on Moshe Rabbeinu. Tefillah Asher is Moshe Rabbeinu, tefillah Moshe. And we know when you the Torah, Moshe's idea is Torah. Like it says in the pasuk Zichru Torah Moshe Avdi, and Lefisha Masanaf Shalad Torah is considered Moshe Rabbeinu because of his Mesiras Nefesh for the Torah. And therefore, Lefichach Nekras Al Shmei. So Torah's whole, Moshe Rabbeinu's whole Metzias is Torah, and Moshe Rabbeinu's whole Metzias is Amal Torah. There's not a person in this world about whom you could say Toraso Umnaso more than Moshe Rabbeinu, who was completely removed from this world. Says the Rebbe Afal Pekain. Still, we find in the Tilim Tzarech Liyas Etzlein Inyan Hilula davened. a movement which proves no matter how high a level of Toraso Umnaso one is on, it's not enough Torah. Even though it's an Umnaso and Tzarich Liyas Amal Sicha, there needs to be also Davening, which is Inyan Hilula. And like I said, later on in this page is also going to be an idea, a reference to the idea of Amal Melacha. Shine. So there's 3 Darkei Avodah, and each one needs all 3. And he proves it further. It's in the idea that a person learns Torah and automatically the Parnasa comes. There's a number of different levels. And the Rebbe gives an example from the Mamer from the Rebbe, where he talks about the difference between Rabbi Yehuda and RaShbI. Rabbi Yehuda was an Amayra, and Rabbi Yehuda's koch was in Ezekiel, was in the Bavis, but Mitzvah, Bekama, Basra. And he would finish Kol Talmud, he would review all of his lamdas every 30 days, and then he would daven once. Rabbi Yehuda's madrega was RaShbI. There was a very big difference in the nature of how their Torah bittled them to the Eibush. You see, that's the whole word. For most people, when you learn Torah, the Torah is Seichel, one of us saga, and there's a sakana if a kid can become Yeshes in Torah. There are not a lot of people that from the Torah comes bittel. You have the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, the whole story with Rabbi, right? What's the Chiddush? That the Rabbi thought he was a Benyani, but that Yitzhak was asleep from learning Torah. The pasuk put him in because the Torah of Rabbi is compared to Benyani Hamispalol Kalayim, because davening puts the Yitzhak to sleep. But for most people, Torah doesn't. The Chiddush of Rabbi Bar Nachmani was that his Torah put his Yitzhak to sleep like Tefillah, meaning to say that his learning Torah had a bittel in it. Right? That's the difference. When the Alter Rebbe says in Igeres HaKedesh, Yud Aleph, pardon me, that the idea of Talmud Torah Yiklum must be a mayim, because in the times of the Shas, from Torah alone, you had a bittul to the Eibush, and that's why it wasn't so important to have tefillah. So the Rebbe says that the degree of Toraso Umnaso depends on the degree that the Torah itself affected a bittul in this person. Ukafi erech bittul nafshi chule, according to the bittul of one's neshama through the limud Torah. This affected the way they brought down godliness through their Torah and through their Avodah in the madrega of Toraso Umnaso. Which is what? It's written about Rabbi Yehuda. Lav dein bad inish ein ze yeludish. He's not a normal person. He has no yitzhak at all. Shahal yevabchinas bittul, and this madrega of Rabbi Yehuda was total bittul to the Eibush. That's what the Madrega was, Madrega of Toraso Umnaso, and he was the Madrega of a king. These are 3 different ideas. Number 1, Toraso Umnaso. Number 2, Leistein Bad Inish, which is bittul. And number 3, there's Madrega of Melech, and this is from Torah Eretz, you see in footnote 20. Afal became nevertheless, in spite of Yehuda's milas, in his Torah, and in his tzidkes, and in his being a melech, ein ze magia la inyan the Toraso Umnaso kfi shayitz RaShbI. You can't compare to the Toraso Umnaso of RaShbI. And there's a difference. V'lachein yeshne gam chilik beinayim binyan atfila. It showed itself on how frequently they davened. The Rabbi Yehuda have a matzli mitlas and yemin mitlas and Yehuda davened every 30 days when he finished Kol Talmud. And Rabbi was pa'amachas bashan, was once a year. So you see from this that a person of Toraso Umnaso has levels. And no matter what level of Toraso Umnaso one is on, there has to be a tefillah, like RaShbI davened once a year, and that Rabbi Yehuda davened every 30 days. Now the Rabbi continues. That even a person who's Toraso Umnaso, and apparently you have to say, even in the Madrega of RaShbI, not only does he need to also daven, but he also needs to do melacha. The limud atarach liyas limud amanas lilamed lishmed velases. He learns in order to do. So that's the amal melacha of a person who's Toraso Umnaso. Now, when it says lases over here, that could mean Torah mitzvahs. It doesn't have to mean going to work. But relative to limud Torah, this is considered an asiyah. Now let me throw this in here. I mean, this is sitting on my throat, but let me throw it in here. That first of all, the halacha is that a person who's Toraso Umnaso doesn't have to daven, but he has to do mitzvahs. And the Mamer explain why. Because tefillah is hamshacha. Tefillah is to bring the Eibishter into the world. And most people cannot bring the Eibishter into the world through Torah, so they have to daven. A person of Toraso Umnaso, his Torah is so high that from the Torah alone, the world changes. Like the famous story about RaShbI, which we're going to have later in the Mamer, in the second Shir. He said Torah on the pasuk, Hine Matev Manoim, Shavasacham Yachad, and it rained. So people whose Torah has a physical effect on the world doesn't need to daven, because what davening is machadish. L'rafeis chelim, or levarech shonim, be'elam hazeh hagashmi is accomplished through Torah alone. Doesn't need tefillah. But mitzvahs he needs. Now, so in this Mamer, the Rebbe said that even Toraso Umnaso also needs tefillah, which is a tzarech biyan. But there's another thing. The Rebbe once spoke in a Mamer. Now, I know this, first of all, because I remember the Rebbe saying it, and second of all, because I taught that Mamer, but I can't remember which it was. But it was in the Mamer in my years in yeshiva. I'm assuming it was before I went on shlichus. That means Mem Gimel, Mem Daled, Mem Hey, Pashtus. Where the Rebbe said that in Toraso Umnaso is madregas, and the highest madrega of Toraso Umnaso is the madrega of RaShbI, and RaShbI was even part of a mitzvah. He didn't have to do mitzvahs. V'haraya, that the 13 years in the cave, he couldn't do mitzvahs. He could only learn Torah. So it seems in a different Mamer that the Rebbe is saying exactly the opposite of what he's saying here. That even mitzvahs he didn't need. But here he's saying that even RaShbI, even though it's Toraso Umnaso, along with the Toraso Umnaso has to be tefillah. In addition to being tefillah, there also has to be lases, which is mitzvahs. And I guess for Toraso Umnaso, that's considered amal melacha, but I'm not sure. However, if what we just said is true, that a person who's Toraso Umnaso also has to daven, and the person who's Toraso Umnaso also has to do amal melacha, asiyah. So what's the whole business of Toraso Umnaso? He has to do all three things. What separates people into three groupings? Some are amal Torah, some are amal masicha, and some are amal melacha. And the answer is, the difference is, this is discussed in Tanya. In the Igeres HaKedesh, Siman Hey. And over there he only speaks two things, he doesn't speak three things. The general difference between Marei Torah, which is the Medei Chacham, and Marei Uvden Tov. People whose mastery is primarily Torah, and people whose mastery is primarily Maisim Tevim. In other words, even though one Yid's primary occupation is Torah, he has to have mitzvahs. And even though the other Yid's primary occupation is mitzvahs, he has to study Torah. You have to also zvul uvden tovin. Has to be a sacher Torah. Both Yidden need both in Yod. The only difference is what they're busy with primarily. But a Yid who's Toraso Umnaso needs tefillah and mitzvahs and asiyah and birurim and amal melacha, even in the madrega of RaShbI. It's explained about the B'Shem Yechai that although Toraso Umnaso, still he had the idea of going out into the work and doing world for the sake of a birur, and he certainly had the union of tefillah, like you mentioned before, that it says in Torah that tefillah from Rabbi in Ibrachas, that tefillah RaShbI was Pamachas Bashan Echaz Yid Beis Chedesh, and the Mezitcha Magid explained the need for that tefillah is because he had to go out into the world. The primary idea of RaShbI was Inyan Torah, the idea of Torah, because the Lakaman is this Mamer is going to develop, and we're going to be learning in our second class, which I guess is going to dominate the Mamer. We were simply going to explain the Madrega of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Says the Rebbe, now that we understand that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, although Toraso Umnaso has to have all three things, tefillah and melacha as well. Yuvan, it's understood. Masha Isa, that's written in the Gemara. Immediately after leaving the cave, his asik ben Yonit Tikkun Ha'elam, he engaged in correcting things in the world, helping people resolve things that needed to be fixed in the world. Fa'ad letikun inyanim, including correcting such things which are shurim and gimel klipas atmeis, which are connected to gimel, which has to do with determining where a cave it is. V'kayetza bezeh shalamatam esei DiRaShbI. So kumisupar, as the Gemara tells the story, shetir mokam shei beged esafik. V'chol, there was a place with an uncertainty what was the status was, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was mavared it. This, of course, is the Gemara Masechta Shabbos that tells the story of Rabbi Shimon being in the cave for 12 years and coming out and not being able to tolerate the world, or the world not being able to tolerate him, so he went back for a 13th year, and then he was able to deal with the fact that there was a world and not everybody was learning Torah day and night. And then he says, the Gemara says that he went to correct things, and he corrected a variety of different things, and one of them was there's a makam, which was a suffix tumah, and Rabbi Shimon was able to determine whether it was tamei or not. So the Rebbe argues that this shows that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was involved in Amal Melacha also. So although Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's Inyan was Amal Torah, without a question, he was Toraso Umnaso, there was by him Amal Tefillah, that he davened once every year. And the Rebbe said from the Mizitcha Maggid there was a God Atiferet Tefillah, and he was also Asik and Birurim of the Elam. And the Rebbe finishes, and this idea, that although Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's Inyan was Amal Torah, there was also Amal Sikh and Amal Melacha, explains to you what his Hilula means, which is Yom Simchasei DiRaShbI, it's the day of his Simcha. That Omar Oz, on that date, he reached the Madrege where he said, Bechat Ketiris Katana V'chuli, that I can become with one knot, with a K, I can become knotted and one with Atmos and Lifnez, Atmos and Zavbarach. Lifnez, on an earlier occasion, he said, Ano Simna B'yalma Mai Mitzi is only a simon for the kus. I'm so bottled to the Eibush that I'm only a simon. But Isa Bezed, there's a third Zayah on the Pasuk Yirah called Zechochas Ne'ad Hashem Malakacha, that his friend said to him, Man Pnei Adna Vaya DiRaShbI. These are three pisgamim that denote the degree of bittul to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai to the Eibishter. One of them was said about him, and two he said of himself. One was said about him, Man Pnei Adna Vaya DiRaShbI. And he said about himself, Ano Simna B'yalma, and the day he passed away, when he reached his highest madrege, he said, in one knot, I'm one with Atmos and Moshe. So Shimon bar Yochai was completely bottled to the Eibush. Shazu Haisa Kol Mitzvah Yossi, the reality of RaShbI was Torah, to the extent of such bittul that there was no RaShbI, there was just a lukus. Afa became still, Yesh Lezeh Shayches Le'inyonim Shal Poyel, Rabbi Shimon was connected also to Amal Sikha, and even to Amal Melacha, there was behavior in his life. Like it says in the Gemara in the Medrash, there was a need to send the shliach to Goyim, to be mevatel gzeiros. They sent Rabbi Shimon. The Roim to Rome. This is another example of RaShbI's Amal Malach. This is the end of the shir, believe it or not. It's a very short shir. But what is this shir saying? This shir is insisting that you should know that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was involved in Birurim. Now it makes sense that the Rebbe would say this Mamer, because there was a Yid who was Toraso Umnaso, who at the same time was Isaac in the Birurim of what the Rebbe calls Gimel Klippus Atmeis Legamish Lamata Meseder, like the Rebbe himself. So the Rebbe is saying a Mamer on the Lag Beimer, Tafshan Lamed Hey, the 25th anniversary of Lag Beimer, is the beginning of his Nesias, which I think is a significant number. And he insists that you should understand that although Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was Torah, he was not removed from the world. There was also Tefillah, and there was also Tikkun Olam mitzvahs, correction, fixing the world. Now, I don't understand this, because I know other places in Chassidus, and perhaps even in the very next shir, on this very, very Mamer, where the Rebbe is going to sort of say the exact opposite. The whole idea of Toraso Umnaso is that the Torah alone takes the place of Tefillah, and the Torah alone takes the place of Melacha. And like I said to you before, the Rebbe has a Mamer where he mentions that even mitzvahs, RaShbI and his son Rabbi Shimon could not do in the 13 years that they were inside the cave. And to me, this seems like a contradiction. It's two focuses, you see. The Rebbe here is focusing, I'm putting words in the Rebbe's mouth, which is a crime, on understanding RaShbI through his lens, through our generation. That there's no way to say that no matter how big a tzaddik Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was, that he was not Asik b'tikkun Birurim. It's impossible to say that. And therefore you have to say that although when Yoni was Toraso Umnaso, there had to be Amal Sikha, he davened, and had to be Amal Melacha, the beat of the world. And like I said, the next shir, which is going to be the longest shir on this Maimon, I think it's 4 pages, we're going to be discussing the Madrega of RaShbI, and the whole point of that shir is to say the opposite of this. L'chayra. That his Torah was so effective that the Torah brought him the Parnasa, the Torah was his Tefillah, and the Torah was Mevadar the world. So I don't know how to reconcile what we learned with what's said in so many other places and what we're going to learn. Unless we say the following, unless we say this, that in Davening and in Birurim, in Melacha, There's two types. There's davening for me personally, and there's davening for the whole world. There's a tikkun in the world for me personally, and tikkun in the whole world. And perhaps that's how you'll explain it, that RaShbI Yachoi, when it came to himself, was only Toraso Umnaso. There was nothing else but Torah. And Malach from his Torah came his food, kipshuta. But when it came to other people, when it came to the world, faket, RaShbI must daven, and he must be Ezik and Tikkun Ha'olam, because Lihavin Inyan Hilula DiRaShbI, this man lived, and he lived in this world, and living in this world means he had to have effect on this world during his physical lifetime and even afterwards. And fakert, it's even more than Bechayav. There's the Gedula, and there's Bishoy's Bechayav Aretz. All of those things, perhaps that's how you resolve it. And I'm just making this up. I'm really just making this up. I'm just thinking out loud, which is, I guess, a crime. That his tefillah that the Rebbe describes was a tefillah which was not Inyan Prati, and that the examples that he brings from involvement in Maisa certainly not Inyan Pratim. He gives two examples of both of them about fixing that affects other people. But I want to finish the share with the Toraso Magid. The Rebbe brought the Torah of the Toraso Magid on the Gemara and the Mishnah Habonim Yitzim B'Ksharim and then Bnei Belachim B'Zugir V'Chaladam. I looked up the Gemara, the Mishnah in Shabbos, and I also looked up the Toraso Magid, which is in the Sefer Torah Magid Mimizrich, near the end. And over there he describes a Yid who's Toraso Umnaso, who has to go to work to feed his family, and therefore he has to daven. Now this is a big kasha, because that was for sure an Inyan Prati, he's going to make parnos. And by RaShbI we for sure say that Toraso Umnaso was in the Madrega of Malach Chanas Sadei Achedim. So that Mamer of the Mizitcha Magid, that even a Yid who's Madrega of Toraso Umnaso has to go make a living, and therefore he has to daven. And if he's on a higher level, the davening can be b'machshava and b'eskashas, ha-machshava alone. And if it's another level, it can be make noise, b'zugir. He brings over there the noise of limud HaTorah, but l'chayre he also means the noise of tefillah. So what's the pshat? What's the pshat? The pshat to answer is that when the Mizitcha Magid is saying this Mishnah and he's explaining, he's not talking about RaShbI. He's talking about other people who are Madrega Toraso Umnaso, because Toraso Umnaso has many levels. And evidently there's a level of a Yid who's Toraso Umnaso that even though Toraso Umnaso, he has to go work and make a living. How do you reconcile that with Malach Chanas Sadei Achedim? Maybe the parnasa comes easy, with little ishtadlos, but there's different madregas of Toraso Umnaso. And a Yid is in a lower madrega of Toraso Umnaso, he has to go out and make a living, get pashtus, and therefore he has to daven. But the Rebbe brings this for RaShbI. The Rebbe here brings this Toraso Magid to discuss RaShbI Yachoi's need for Torah, for tefillah, pardon me. And he qualifies it by saying that this is Mikiv and Jazal b'Inyan Omok Yese Negei Sham Inyan Atfila b'Yese, and he compares it to Tefillah l'Maisha. So my suspicion is, and I'm on a very, very thin limb, is that when the Rebbe brings the Toraso Magid, that a person who's Toraso Umnaso has to daven, the Toraso Magid directly is talking about someone who's in a madrega of Toraso Umnaso, which is a lower level. But the Rebbe is inferring from that Toraso Magid that it applies to everybody Toraso Umnaso, even people who are on higher levels. In other words, he's reading the Toraso Magid not to be describing the person who's actually going to work to earn parnasa, but he's using that Torah, which is discussing a person who's Toraso Umnaso that needs to go to work and earn parnasa, to apply it to a Yid who's Toraso Umnaso that doesn't need to do that, that even by him there has to be a tefillah. And he's also further inferring that since he doesn't have to go work to make up parnasa, and his davening is in a much higher madrega, so it's a much deeper type of tefillah. In other words, he's taken Toraso Magid and explaining it in a way which is more than the Poshet Kavana of the Mizitcha Magid. That's my thought. So I gave a short little shir and did a lot of talking, and I talked in ways that I probably shouldn't. The nakud of today's shir is that every person has one ikir amo, Torah, tefillah, melacha, but all three need all three, including RaShbI. And RaShbI did tefillah, RaShbI did tikkun, and that's Hilul DiRaShbI. If you want to understand RaShbI Yachoi, think of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a Yid who sat and learned Torah day and night, but he didn't sit in his shtibel and not see the world. He was metaken as Elam, wherever there was a need. And if need be, he went to Roimi, and he was a vatlik this. And I think that's the spirit of this shir on this Mamer. Now the next shir we're going to skip page 381. We're going to come back to it in the third shir, And we're going to go to page 382, where the Rebbe begins Lihavin Inyan RaShbI. This is going to be the next class. And in this class, you'll get the opposite impression. That Toraso Umnaso means you don't need tefillah, and you don't need melacha. And again, perhaps the resolution is, like I said before, that if it's inyan prati, you don't need it, but in klali it's necessary. V'adayin tzarich inyan gadol.